Hello everyone, this is Scarzig and welcome back to another design talk. Today I'm going to be talking about the big purple elephant in the room, Grandmaster Variax. Now, the thing about Grandmaster Variax, I'm also going to be talking about Shadow Spawn, the Bloodborne spell that she grants to Lilith, right, where you're spawning like huge wraithlings every turn. Because I mean, it pretty much does the same thing for Cassava, where you're getting multiple bodies off of your Shadow Creep tiles. So pretty much, Grandmaster Variax does the same thing for both generals, but mainly, as we've all seen, Variax is used in Lilith. So I want to talk a little bit about the design behind this card. Why it's causing problems, what factors are leading onto that, what could possibly be done. I There's a lot of points that I need to cover, and so I actually have some notes here in front of me. So I want to make sure that I cover everything. So let's get right into it. I want to start by saying that Variax is theoretically fine on its own, right? Like on paper, it seems like a good card. It's supposed to be like a late game ender, right? Like Silithar Elder. It's just like this late game value engine that once you last to 7 mana, you plop it down. You have to wait another turn to use your Bloodborne spell, and then all of a sudden you have this infinite like loop of minions and minions and minions coming down. But Darkfire Sacrifice is the thing that really makes this card broken because it just gets ramped out so fast, and then suddenly you can't deal with those minions. We see sometimes in the Variax deck where they don't draw Variax right away, and we kind of get a preview of how that matchup would typically go down when they actually do play Variax naturally on 7 or 8 mana, and go from there, where they're trying to hide in a corner to keep their opponent away and then spawn all of these forces to send across the map and slowly take it over, just like Silithar Elder. But that's really where the comparison ends, because Silithar Elder, you still have a chance to deal with it once it comes down, because they nerfed it to a 6/6, or you can dispel it, or if you have a means to take care of the eggs and just make sure it just stays as one Silithar Elder, right? So the Variax, because you can't stop its effect once it comes down and you get that Bloodborne spell, you can't stop it, and that's one of the things that really makes this card a pain to deal with, is because once it comes down, there's just no stopping it. It just adds this inevitability to the Abyssian late game, which they've kind of always had, right? Because we all remember old Shadow Nova obliterates kind of like that, where there's a bunch of creep tiles on the board and you're just kind of hoping they don't draw it, right? There's that inevitability of eventually they'll win the game, and Variax kind of adds that to the game in a way that has caused a lot of contention. But to move on to some other key points, Variax made a big splash when the deck first was conceived, right? And I think it swept a couple tournaments when it first came onto the scene, and a few articles were written about it, of course. But it didn't stick, right? Because Variax does have some exploitable weaknesses, where because the Darkfire Sacrifice ramping out Variax thing is technically a combo deck, there's still that inherent inconsistency of a combo deck where you just don't get the pieces at all, or you just get them super late, and then by then you can't come back from what your opponent has been doing all game. And then there's the weakness where Variax, you just die, where your opponent's playing super aggressive, and then they can just kill you before you get your value engine running. And those are some pretty clear cut weaknesses. There's the inherent combo weakness, and then the weakness to just getting rushed down, which is important. It gives the deck itself a little counterplay, but Grandmaster Variax, the card itself, does not have that much counterplay. You see what I mean? Plus, it's a lot easier to see it coming in tournaments, so to right away adapt your playstyle to be more aggressive, or to try to hold on to some additional answers, depending on the matchup, of course. And of course, different factions are going to have different ways to deal with Variax once it comes down. Like Vanar has Enfeeble. Maybe you just back away, keep the Wraithlings under control, and you burn your opponent out with Fae, right? So I'm gonna get to that. I'm gonna touch on that a little bit later. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I wanted to also talk about Variax. I already talked about it, how it pertains to Silithar Elder, which is one of its closest matches, but the Variax combo deck probably is more closely resembling Mechazor, right? The way it's designed around ramping out this enormous threat that your opponent can't deal with, and then you just finish out the game. That's most Mechazor decks. And you do have to go aggressive in both matchups, right? Generally, that's the way you deal with Mechazor. If you're especially if you're playing a faction that doesn't have an easy answer. You want to take advantage of the tempo slump of Variax, because when you play that card, even if you ramp it out on 3 or 4 mana, you still spend your turn playing one big body, probably not much else in the turns leading up to it. So Variax really leaves you open. If you're already behind on board, your opponent might just be able to remove the body, the Variax body, and then just go right for your throat. Or maybe because you can't cast your Bloodborne spell for your you have to wait to your next turn, or maybe even depending on what your cooldowns are looking like, maybe not till the turn after that. There's definitely that slump before the engine ramps up and takes over the game. And so you need to take advantage of that slump with aggression. And Mechazor kind of has that same weakness. And so people, I think, haven't been making too much of a stink about this card because they think, they think it's like Mechazor, right? And I can just go aggressive and beat it, and then you just kind of throw your hands up in the air, where sometimes you can't beat Mechazor because it comes out too fast, or you didn't get your answer. And then Variax, sometimes it comes out too fast, or sometimes you don't get your answer, and so you just chalk it up to bad luck. But Variax goes a little bit deeper than that, in my opinion. As I said, you can deal with Silithar Elder, you can deal with Mechazor because you can use Ephemeral Shroud, yada yada yada. We know everybody has that mental list of stuff that deals with Mechazor in case they ever come across it. But there's no Crossbones for Variax. And here's the thing. The Crossbones, for those of you who don't recall, is a 3/3 for 3 mana, and it has the opening gambit, you destroy a ranged unit. And so you can use that to take out a pesky Heartseeker, of course, but it's mainly used as the counter to Mechazor. Back in the day, there was a really short meta where Mechazor was a really good deck, actually. And it was being played a lot because even though people knew it was coming, their decks weren't really tuned. The meta was still shifting to adjust to this surge of Mechazor entering the ladder and the tournament scene. And so people started taking Crossbones into their deck, sort of like how Hall of Grovekeeper beats Provokes. So when Inquisitor Kron was all over the place, people started putting in a bunch of Grovekeepers to counter that. And that's what Crossbones offered as a way to counter Mechazor. But Variax does not have like just a hard counter as a safety valve to keep it from spiraling out of control. Fortunately, Variax isn't warping the meta where a safety valve type of counter like that is actually required. And I don't want to go into that discussion today, but people really dislike hard counter cards like Crossbones or Hollow Grovekeeper because it's like they believe that you should just make sure the cards are balanced rather than having to put in a card that you basically need to include in order to counter the card. You know what I mean? Because it reduces variety. And again, don't want to get sucked into that. Maybe if you guys want to hear about that, I'll make it into its own video. But anyway, moving on. Now, Variax, when it comes down, I touched on this a little bit before, because it changes your Bloodborne spell permanently, it lacks counterplay. And this was a concern that was actually brought up, I recall, when a few of the cards were spoiled for Rise of the Bloodborne, Variax and Geomancer, right? Where they permanently change your Bloodborne spell. And you're still giving up the utility of having your Bloodborne spell. And you still have to pay increased mana for the new Bloodborne spell. The problem is that once that comes down, there's no way for you to actually play around it or counter it or deal with it. Like if your opponent plays Geomancer, they just have infinite Phoenix Fires, and you can't outplay Phoenix Fire. It just hits you in the face. And they're still just getting it every turn. the Geomancer, of course, what is it, like a 5 mana 5/4, like off the top of my head. And it's like, again, you still get that tempo slump. You're making a big upfront investment for long-term value. And I think that that's what the developers were relying on to balance these cards, is just the huge upfront cost would balance out the long-term value that they could get you. But again, it's just they sort of sidestep your opponent being able to answer or interact with what you're doing, because you're saying, oh, I get to change my Bloodborne spell, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now I'm just going to keep using it over and over again. And don't get me wrong, your current Bloodborne spell, like the one that everybody has, does that too. You can't interact with your opponent's Bloodborne spell. There's still, like, everybody has that, like, maybe you interact with Warbird a little bit, right, where you're positioning your minions around it. Maybe you can interact with Lilith's Bloodborne spell, or Riva's, if you fully surround them and then they can't spawn their minion or something. But I think it's just in terms of getting in such a strong additional power, I think is the key point here. But the thing is, some suggestions regarding that might be having cards like Geomancer or Variax not just change your Bloodborne spell outright, but just give you a certain amount of charges to use. And that could be interesting. It's just that Geomancer is kind of not played anyway, and with Variax, very rarely are you going to survive 2 or 3 initial casts anyway. Like, if you couldn't end the game right when Variax dropped, and you didn't win it like on the next turn, once that first set of Wraithlings comes down, and once that second set of Wraithlings comes down, like, it doesn't matter if they're suddenly out of charges. That's pretty much all they need to win the game. Anything beyond that is overkill. Because of Shadow Spawn, awesome Shadow Spawn's interaction with Wraithling Swarm, you can cast Wraithling Swarm, and then Shadow Spawn buffs all of those Wraithlings into huge 5/5s as well. So I don't think the charge system would work very well. Plus, it's kind of clunky, right? You could try nerfing Variax's body. This might be a different answer, where you want to make it a riskier play to use Variax, or basically when you ramp it out like that, it's less of a strong initial threat for you to deal with, and so it allows you to possibly finish out the game a bit more. It definitely makes it that it would make it a high risk, high reward sort of thing, I guess. Because Variax is a 7/7, in order to offset that tempo loss, they still want you to place down a threatening body, something that your opponent is forced to deal with. And if you still have to take that turn off of killing Variax, possibly trading in whatever board you just had developed to deal with this huge thing that came down turn 3, or use, most of your mana for the turn, killing it with a removal spell, it's pretty much done its job. It's just there to keep you at bay, so that next turn Lilith can get the value engine going. And so maybe if they made the body a little bit easier to overcome, we might see people not feeling so bad about losing. Again, it might require a bit more setup, where you want to have a slightly stronger board and not just relying on the Variax 7/7 body to carry you through. But if that were to happen, it might make the risk of trying to run Variax too great, right? Where you're just ramping out this huge threat, and then it just gets knocked over because he's paper thin, and you just get smorked every time. You just get rushed down every time. Like, there's nothing there to stop to overcome that tempo slump. And so I think that would really make the card terrible. And so then you have, like, this really interesting card, right? Because the concept of having this late game value, like just destroyer of late game, is really cool, and the concept of upgrading your Bloodborne spell to something ridiculous is really cool. And I think that just in this situation it was implemented poorly, just because you're able to bring it out so early. Again, just to repeat my first point, Darkfire Sacrifice is what's really making Grandmaster Variax broken, in my opinion. I would love to see, like a big Abyssian deck that is just built around lasting till late game. Like, maybe if they made Grandmaster Variax 9 mana, and this was like the be-all, end-all late game play, and you just had like this heavy control Abyssian, that might be something interesting to see. But again, Darkfire Sacrifice just makes that not a possibility. And I know that Big Abyssian is an archetype that Counterplay talked about, that they something they really wanted to explore for Abyssian as an archetype, like being able to ramp out stuff, or just being, playing really big bodies, because they have stuff like Nether Summoning. Um, the problem with that, though, I don't want to get sucked into a separate discussion about the Big Abyssian archetype, is that Spectral Revenant is just so damn good. You don't need to play anything big, because Spectral Revenant just comes down, deals 6 damage or 10 damage or 12 damage, or however long, however much value you can get. It's going to do at least 4 damage, like if you use it to clear something, because it's so good as just a burst tool and also removal, right? So that's a discussion for another time as well. The other thing I wanted to quickly wrap up with regarding Variax is that if you can't deal with your opponent, like if you can't kill them, right, it's Variax drops, and then these Wraithlings start spawning. What do you do then? What do you do then, right? You just lose the game, or 2, you happen to be playing a deck with a lot of out-of-hand damage or burn or something. So you run away and try to stall as long as possible so you can get your burn combo and kill them. So what you're doing is you're up against this deck that lacks counterplay, right? Once they get this combo off and they get this engine up and running, and you can't beat it anymore, you physically can't beat it, because they're just getting all these huge bodies that are eating up your resources. So you back away and then you use burn, which is a damage type, an archetype that has always been criticized for its lack of counterplay. So you're countering a lack of counterplay by doing something with even less counterplay, right? So you get this I don't want to interact with you arms race going on, and that's just not good at all, where the counter to something in the game is to just have less interaction. So that's pretty bad. So hopefully we can address that. If, again, maybe Variax becomes a late game monster card where it's like 9 mana, or maybe Darkfire Sacrifice is changed in some way to make it so you can't bring it out so fast, and maybe if burn is reduced, right, we're adding more interaction with the opponent into the game. But the reason that this you're either playing Variax or you're playing burn is like this feedback loop is held in check is, one, Variax at the moment is not like a tier 1 deck. I already mentioned earlier, it's not like warping the meta, not the way that we have seen decks and archetypes warp the meta in the past, where they just do what they do so efficiently that other decks just can't possibly deal with them. Pre-nerf Riva comes to mind. Old third +3/+3 blast, third wish comes to mind, where your deck, it was like every faction was like in a tier list of how well can you deal with third wish, and that was like, it was destroying the meta. Like old Lantern Fox like destroyed. But anyway, it's definitely not on that level that we've seen in the past. Right now, because Variax is treated like it's treated like Mechazor, and it's like it's not stomping noobs at the bottom of the ladder because the deck is expensive to begin with. Abyssian in general is already very noob unfriendly because how expensive their really good cards are, and because they rely on so much in-faction synergy that you need to get all of these cards to actually have like a decent Abyssian deck. At lower levels of the ladder, we all know that Abyssian relies on your opponent just not having the proper tools or knowledge to deal with what you're doing. They aren't going to be cleaning your Wraithlings as consistently. They aren't going to have the right tools, or they aren't going to save those tools to deal with Blood Moon Priestess or something, and it just spirals out of control, and you see that all the time. But again, usually because Grandmaster Variax is from Rise of the Bloodborne, an expansion that you can't craft the cards from, it's going to be pretty much exclusively used in higher reaches of the ladder by more experienced players that already have an extensive collection. They're going to be able to build decks that support this card. So that's just honestly a good thing, where Variax isn't just the noob crusher Mechazor 2.0 of the bottom of the ladder, and because Abyssine is so expensive and it's not strong enough to like completely warp the tournament scene or the meta around it. So I guess to sum up, Variax can like exist in its current state because it's not absolutely destroying the game, but it definitely shouldn't exist in its current state, right? Just because it's so frustrating. The position that it holds right now is tenuous at best, because if Rise of the Bloodborne cards ever become easier to get your hands on, or an Abyssian, really fancy Abyssian decks become more common towards the bottom of the ladder, or something happens to the archetype where it just explodes and starts to take over, then people are really going to start to see this as more of a pain point than it actually is. Or I should say, they'll see it as more of a pain point than they currently do, because it is pretty major for the game, in my opinion. And I think that about wraps it up. I hit all my points here in my notes. Again, just want to talk about pretty much what the contention around this card is and what makes it so lame, right? And what possibly could be done. But let me know what you think about Grandmaster Variax, and let me know about maybe some subjects that you would like to see me talk about in my next design talk video. I'll see you then, and you have a good one.